Hello everyone, is Bringonthechaos Glizzy for another What If. Beerus is an Olympian god of destruction. Beerus has been erased because of the mistake Goku, but he encountered the fathers of all angels. He is in a new world field of gods. What will happen to a former G.O.D?
The Olympian god of destruction. Chapter 14, the Titanomachy 7. Back on Crete. A strong shockwave billowed out through almost the entire isle as a ghostly pale fist coated with a dark aura smashed directly into a feminine cheek full force, sending the latter flying back as their guard was slipped through. Their body careening through the air before plowing upper back and head first
straight into the bottom side of the Mount Lycaos. The mountain briefly shuddered as a crater 6
debris falling down to the ground as well. The figure of Rhea emerged from the crash site with a trickle of ichor running down the corner of her lips and a bruise on her cheek that healed away as swiftly as it was seen. The Mother of Seven then launched forward with blurring speed toward the form of Hades, who'd sent her flying in the first place. She was intercepted, however, by the more tanned form of Poseidon enveloped in a sea-green aura, who flashed right in front of her and Hades as she'd cocked a fist back with a leg already torqued back. The Titaness immediately shape-shifted into a snake to avoid the oncoming kick and bite down on his exposed neck, only to be caught out as her second youngest son anticipated this. His hand whizzing out and grabbing her by her serpentine head to halt her forward momentum before slamming his kick directly into her underbelly, sending her serpent form shunting another good distance away with a booming shockwave just as big as the one before. She almost collided with the mountain again at a much higher elevation, were it not for her shapeshifting again into an eagle and barrel rolling through the air to recover her balance and halt her trek back before she spread out her feathery wings. The now avian goddess turning her attention away from the two brothers in a split-second decision as she sought out her three daughters. All of which were grouped around the same area around 50 meters away from the male gods, more to Rhea's left, and dive-bombed right at them. Her gaze narrowing in on Demeter as Hera and Hestia jumped back right as she came close. Demeter wasted no time in shapeshifting herself into the same eagle that her mother had become to meet her charge with a focused look. The only two things separating them in appearance being the different color of their eyes, one dark, the other olive brown, and their auras, the former being a darker orange than the latter. The transformed fledgling goddess flying up as her mother dived down and swerved to the side at the last second, dodging her mother's initial attack. She flew further up from there as her performed a swift U-turn and chased after her, seemingly gaining on her daughter very quickly, prepping her taloned feet for attack. The younger goddess in avian form suddenly performed an about-face and bared her own taloned feet right at her fast-approaching mother, forcing the older goddess to swerve out of the way this time to avoid getting her face torn up. They seem to be doing quite well against Mother, I must say. Zeus commented appraisingly from his spot away from the action, sat on a slab of stone with Metis by his side as both watched his parent and siblings' latest spar against the other. Since Beerus and Styx' departure, everyone had simply gone back to doing their own thing as they awaited their return. The children of Styx had elected to sit and chat idly amongst themselves a reasonable distance away from the others whilst waiting for their mothers and Beerus's return, whilst occasionally watching over at the parent-children spar going down away from them. Zeus's siblings were of course training dutifully with their mother to fully master their inner power, whilst he and his consort spectated them improve themselves. The goat nymph, and his main caretaker following his birth, Amalthea, having chosen to take a nap just outside the mountain cave's entrance, with Gaia stood next to her. The primordial goddess watching those down below out of the corner of her eye, but mostly keeping her gaze out over the horizon. Her body quivering with anticipation for the return of her baby boys, as she kept her hands clasped down by her crotch. Indeed, Metis nodded with an impressed gaze, as she kept up with the action with a calculative eye. Watching on as both mother and daughter began to circle around one another up about 20 meters in the air looking for an opening. They are all progressing along a good deal faster than Rhea initially anticipated a week ago, it seems. As she said this, Rhea rose up higher, flapping her feathery wings in the air, and believed she'd spotted an opening as she quickly drove down again with her talons out front and at the ready. Instead of being caught out, however, Demeter remarkably timed her attacking mother well and swayed to the side just in the nick of time to avoid getting ripped up by her avian parent's claws, and while her mother was careening past her, was able to swiftly dive down with her. And before her mother could fully halt her own momentum, Demeter bared her own claws and drove them viciously into Rhea's feathery back, scraping them down hard enough to leave gash wounds from the neck all the way down near the backside. A pained squawk erupted from Rhea's beak as ichor began to ooze out from the deep cuts inflicted. She made to turn and bare either her beak or talons in defense, only to be caught by several rapid-fire pecks to the front of one of her wings mid-turn that not only mashed it into her side but were deep enough that they also drew ichor that fell in droplets down to the ground. She followed immediately after, plummeting to the ground as the damage made keeping herself airborne impossible for a small moment. She turned back into her humanoid form before she struck the ground with an impressive thud that formed a crater a few feet wide and deep. The Titaness held her now bleeding arm, with her back also dripping blood down her clothed ass and legs as the gash marks began to close up quickly while kneeling on one of her knees. She immediately looked upwards and saw her still eagle-transformed daughter diving straight for her with her clawed feet primed for another assault. Standing upright with her arm and back heeling over completely, Eagle Demeter was only about a foot away from her when Rhea hopped off the ground, brought both her knees up to her chest, squishing some of her perky D-cup breasts inward in the process as she angled her feet toward the attacking bird. She then shot them forward surprisingly in a blisteringly fast drop kick aimed directly for the approaching Demeter's beaked bird face. The latter's eyes widened briefly in panic but managed to keep a grip over herself all the same. Not allowing herself to be taken off guard, she also turned herself back to her humanoid form with her legs bent up towards her ample bosom, briefly squishing a portion of her own D-cup boobs down within her tunic before snapping them down in a dropkick to meet her mom's. Their bare feet smashing against one another and forming a decently strong shockwave that created the ground beneath them twice as wide and deep as both used the force of their attack and the other's feet to propel themselves away from the other with a backflip. In Demeter's case, given her typical absent-mindedness, that kind of quick thinking was quite the upgrade from her abysmal start when they'd first begun training. Both landed rather elegantly on the ground a good number of meters away from the other with a tremendously focused and serious expression aimed at each other. Rhea's was cut short, however, as she was confronted with Hera, who, like Poseidon, did not wait for her mother to come to her this time, and rather made her way over to her in the blink of an eye. The parent being forced to bring an arm up to block the high kick that was thrown, but still ended up pushing her back a good deal, digging twin trenches in the hard soil with her feet as she was sent back a good few meters. The youngest of her daughters chasing her with graceful swiftness, at least by Rhea's standards, and being right in her face again even before her feet had ground her to a halt. Her body outlined by a fiery red aura. The Titaness was forced to bring up her arms to protect her face as Hera launched another high kick, with the flat of her foot impacted roughly with the older goddess' forearms, sending her back even further and a little faster this time with the female Titan's feet coming off the trenched ground. As she was flung back, she turned herself into a spry, lithe lioness, a healthy shade of tawny brown, and flipped herself over, landing on all fours with her paws as she bared her fangs before rushing at her daughter with jaw-dropping speeds. Hera didn't buckle at this, however. Instead, meeting her mother's charge while taking a different approach to her older sister Demeter. Rather than shapeshifting into the same creature her mother had, she elected to change herself into another type of bird, one that dumbfounded even Rhea as she charged right at her. A peacock of all things, though not like the ones that mortals knew of in other universes. Her tail of feathers, for instance, above her bluish, feathered body, not having the eyes that one would associate with the elegant bird adorned on the train, which was bare. She stood now at only 95 centimeters in height, and bent her avian body down, beak forward in preparation for her mother's assault. Both Zeus and Metis especially, given she'd seen and knew of both creatures beforehand, were also taken aback by Hera's out-of-the-box choice. The Oceanid wondering exactly why Hera thought that was a good idea, given that the bird she'd turned into didn't stack up well at all against a lioness, and put her at a disadvantage. However, the goddess in training proved some sly resourcefulness here by ducking under her mother just as she pounced for her, skillfully running underneath the briefly airborne apex predator, but Rhea was quick to follow her path. The elder deity turning just as she landed and chasing after her daughter, who ran ahead before leaping into the air and casting herself into flight. Something Rhea met by leaping after her and easily catching up to her tail with another brutal pounce, seemingly about to land this time, prepping her canines for a bite down just like a wild lion would have. Only for Hera to craftily dart to the side, narrowly avoiding her mother's latest attack by a hair, before flapping her wings and dropping down to perch herself on her mother's furry back just before she landed down on the ground with her talons. Rhea roared in a small form of intimidation and made to ward her daughter off as she landed by turning her head back and lashing out to bite her with her sharp teeth, which Hera's bird head deftly dodged before leaning in and opening her beak by one of the lioness's ears. An ear-piercing shriek followed that had both the spectating Zeus and Metis, along with the rest of Hera's siblings, and even the children of Styx sitting out a ways off on stone slabs of their own cringing as they watched the altercation. Rhea, meanwhile, felt her eardrum burst the instant that horrible screech passed through her ear, deafening her in that one ear at least for the moment as well as disorienting her. Her large cat body stumbling as her equilibrium was jarringly disrupted, and she let out a small whine of pain. It was only then that Hera leapt off and transformed herself back to her normal appearance. She then thrust a leg out and smashed the front of her bare foot into the side of the lion-transformed Rhea, sending her maternal parent barreling forward, skipping hard across the ground over 100 feet away in the blink of an eye. The Titaness coming to a stop on all fours again as she managed to regain her balance soon after, a pained grimace still on her feline features as her eardrum healed over in no time. A bruised rib from Hera's kick also healing away the instant following. Zeus whistled, thoroughly impressed by both the plan of attack, and the perfectly shaped, round ass that showed through Hera's tunic for the brief instant she landed in a crouch. Wow, that was some impressive strategy right there. Quite crafty. Metis nodded in agreement. About a week ago, they were still struggling to a degree to keep up with Rhea, but now they've caught up to her in less than half the time it should have taken. Their reflexes, timing, perception, speed and strength have all seen the most improvement. She said before she thought it would take them 3 weeks, but seeing this right now, I think they'll need only a week from now at most to fully master their inner power at the rate this is going. And if they were each on their own giving Rhea a run for her money here before they'd fully reached that point, it spoke volumes of how strong they'd all end up being in the future if they ever tapped into the true potential. She then turned to look at Zeus with a grin. I think you and Beerus truly have lit a fire in 'em to push themselves that much harder. The spars you two have had seem to have really given 'em a lot more motivation to better themselves faster, from where I'm sitting. That's good. The faster they improve, the better. We're all in this together against Kronos and his allies, after all. Zeus remarked seriously, though there was a bit of a smile on his bearded face knowing he'd been a help to his other siblings indirectly through his spars with his eldest brother. Speaking of Beerus, I have to say, I'm looking forward to his return with those sons of Gaia trapped in Tartarus. The way Gaia built 'em up, they sound like game changers. I've personally never met them, but if Lady Gaia vouches for them the way that she has, they'll definitely be an incredible addition to our ranks. I just hope Beerus and sister are able to pull it all off without a hitch. You doubting 'em now? Zeus asked his consort with some bit of amusement, just as both spotted Rhea setting her sights on Hestia, the last and eldest of Zeus's siblings. It's not that I doubt them. I know what both are capable of for the most part, it's just that there are so many things that could still go wrong. You can't fault me for being a little worried at least, even knowing how good both of them are. Metis replied genuinely, letting that bit of worry show on her beatific features while still maintaining her calmness. Hey, they'll be fine. Zeus waved her off with a confident grin, as he leaned in and kissed her on the cheek. His tone full of such belief in what he'd said that Metis couldn't help but have her worries assuaged completely. In fact, I guarantee you they'll be back within the hour, with everything in order. Hyperion sent off the trail, and the Cyclopes and Hecatonchias with them. Just have a little faith. Metis smiled back, before leaning in and kissing Zeus a little deeper on the lips. When they separated, she nodded her head in confidence of Zeus's own words. I will. She then turned to look out fully at the action, as Rhea shapeshifted back to her normal state and made a beeline for the oldest of her 7 spawn. Now, I wonder how Hestia will fare. The answer came along quick, as Rhea was upon her instantly, ignoring the guilt that came from going after her. Hestia, following her viewing of Beerus and Zeus's spars, had been motivated like the rest to get better, and had thus asked her to go harder on her in training, even if it meant seriously trying to harm her. Naturally, neither Rhea or anyone else was comfortable with that at all, but her oldest daughter had requested of it in earnest, even if she detested violence, for it was the best way to ensure she'd be ready and able for what was to come. To be there to aid her fellow siblings in any way she could in the coming war. In the end, Rhea had folded and accepted Hestia's wish and given her what she wanted. Back to the present, rather than go for an attack immediately like her younger sister Hera, Hestia went more for the opposite approach to Hera's aggressive tactics. She did well to block, parry and dodge any blow thrown at her, using mainly her arms to block attacks from both her mother's arms and legs that snapped around with swift, decent combinations of punches and kicks. The eldest daughter taking a far more defensive approach, as Rhea tested her guard and reflexes, not letting up for a second with her attacks, pushing Hestia further back. The mother then changed tactics and, fully recovered from the wounds dealt prior, being shapeshifting into multiple different creatures in quick succession. Rhea first transformed into a snake after her latest punch was blocked and wrapped around Hestia's arm before attempting to coil around the rest of her body to bind her, something that Hestia easily avoided by quickly turning herself into a snake and quickly slithering away from her mother's coiling body before turning back to normal and facing her serpentine parent. Rhea followed up immediately afterward by lunging towards her as a snake and transforming mid-lunge into an eagle again, gliding through the air with talons prepped to tear into her face, pushing down how awful she felt for trying to at all. She needn't have bothered, for Hestia jumped back while turning into an eagle herself, just as Demeter had done, and entered into a bit of a cat and mouse game with her mother soaring and circling further up into the sky. The latter looking for the perfect opening, while the former seemed to be stalling. The rest watched on as Rhea dove in upon appearing to find her opening for attack, aiming to spear right into either her daughter's wing or midsection with her sharp beak. Her body flying down as if she'd been shot out of a cannon, looking like a blur as she got within mere inches of her daughter, who didn't look like she'd be able to react in time. At the last second though, Hestia transformed her avian body into a small mouse's, hopping right onto the head of the eagle as it shunted down, running along its back with her tiny feet, before jumping right off her tail down about 1 or 2 meters to the ground. Her forming shifting back to her normal state as she landed on her feet without a hitch, but Rhea was already hot on her trails, forming back into a lioness as she turned and drove herself down for her akin to a speeding bullet, only far faster. Her claws out and fangs bared as she growled, coming down for a plunging pounce. Right as she came close, however, a homely, golden aura tinged with white fell over her figure before a warm pulse seemed to emit from the stationary Hestia. Although she was forcing herself to do this anyway for her daughter's sake, Rhea found all her will, all her drive to attack being snuffed out in an instant. Her claws retracted, and her maw came close to being closed on instinct as ferocity turned to docility out of nowhere, in a change so whiplashing mentally that Rhea was briefly left totally vulnerable and out of sorts. And as she came within breathing distance of Hestia, the younger goddess in training struck out with a palm strike right into her feline cheek. Spittle mixed with a small bit of ichor flew out of her mouth as she once again sent hurtling away with a sonic boom following after that made the entire aisle ring, her body forming back to her humanoid look as she tumbled over the ground almost like a child rolled down a very rough, bumpy hill, ripping off multiple chunks of ground as she barreled by. When she eventually brought herself to a stop on her hands and knees, she'd been sent a good several hundred feet out, positioned close to a middle point of sorts as each of children were around her in a wide circle. Despite this though, Zeus and Metis found themselves blinking in some bit of astonishment at what they'd just seen, whilst the former's other siblings stared at Hestia with varying looks of bewilderment at what had just happened, leaving a very brief, but poignant pause in the air. This was quickly broken by a small bout of clapping, as Rhea rose to her feet, another small trickle of ichor coming from the corner of her lips along with another nasty, purplish bruise that healed away almost as quickly as it was seen. Well done, all of you. You all managed to find a good opening and took full advantage of it. I am beyond impressed by your progress. We're not even finished with your inner power training and yet you're all giving me a hard time already. I honestly couldn't be prouder of you all. The Titaness smiled with pride as she threw out some praise where it was due to her children, who all grinned back at her as the battling was put into a lull period. About time, I'd say. We've all been watching how you moved and reacted this whole time since our physical training began. It was only a matter of time before we finally got good enough to catch you out. Hades seemed to speak up for everyone, sounding quite happy with himself over his progress, and his mother's honest praise, as his and everyone else's aura faded away. The others nodding at his words. And that you all certainly have. Rhea nodded. Here I thought I'd made it harder on you all today by throwing up a barrier to stop dematerialization, but instead, it seems I've only made things harder on myself with how vastly you've all improved. It won't be long now before you've all surpassed your dear mother completely. Of course, she meant just with inner power exclusively for now, and they all knew it. Without true divine forms of their own, they would still be overall far below her, but she doubted it would take them any longer than about 5 to 10 years at most for them all to achieve that state for themselves. Well, almost all of them anyway. There was one among them right now she was starting to think would go along in that process quicker than the rest. Hestia, she called to her eldest child with delight, looking to her with a gaze that spoke volumes of how impressed she was right now. You especially have truly outdone yourself. You've always had that calming aura to you, one we've all felt before, but this is the first time I've seen, and more importantly felt you weaponize on someone like that. For a moment there, I felt so pacified that I couldn't imagine doing anything offensive in the least. It was as if every fiber of my being had suddenly become totally against the very notion and became utterly subdued near your presence. Truly remarkable, dear. Hestia actually blushed a small bit from the praise, smiling brightly and kindly with pinkish cheeks. Her golden, glowing eyes tinged with some bit of embarrassment and humility, a sight that could have melted even the blackest of hearts with how pure and innocent she looked. I appreciate the praise, Mother, but surely it wasn't that special. In my opinion, it seems like everyone did just as good a job, if not better. HMPH. Well, aren't you the humble one, sister? Hera said with some bit of bemusement as she propped her hands on her hips, but otherwise smiled at her older sibling just as the others did too, knowing that was just how she was, and none of them were in any mood to change that about her. Or anything about her for that matter. And here I thought Beerus was the only one with an abnormality. Metis thought to herself critically, as she watched them all chat amongst themselves for a minute before presumably going back to training. Even before he started his true divine form training with gear, he was able to throw destructive attacks that took far longer to heal from than they should have. It looks like Hestia also has her own unique little quirk as well, in being able to calm someone to the point where they lose the will to fight. If that could be harnessed correctly, that could be insanely hard to deal with, even for Kronos and his strongest allies. And no doubt Rhea had taken note of that as well. It probably wouldn't work if they entered their ascended states, but if or when she eventually got one of her own, all bets were off. There was no telling at that point if anyone would be able to resist it, a fact that was both comforting and frightening in a way as well, given how helpless she could potentially make someone with it. Well, I'd say Beerus'll definitely be quite interested to learn about Hestia's latest development, for sure. Zeus remarked casually, eyeing his eldest sister with a form of respect as a humid grin took over his features. I'd say this could throw even him for a loop. When he and Hestia do spar, it'll sure be interesting to see what he thinks of it. And more importantly, how he handled it, because if his experience with him was any indication, he'd undoubtedly have some way for Hestia to improve it and the rest of her abilities in a way that even their mother simply couldn't. And he didn't mean that to sound disrespectful to her, it just felt like the truth to him, given that Beerus's seemingly natural-born knowledge and ability for combat was second to none. Something that was proving invaluable to him with all the strides he'd made over the week following mastering his inner power, given how much sharper he was already. He was getting a bit ahead of himself now though. Beerus wasn't even back yet with Styx and Gear's other sons. Best to leave all this until he arrived back, hopefully within the hour. And then, as if fate itself had been listening, vast amounts of gold particles suddenly converged in an instant close by to all of them, heralding an arrival from what could have only been one party. Everyone suddenly halted in what they were doing then, as a ludicrous pressure flooded through the aisle, followed by 3 massive shadows that were suddenly cast over all of them. Their senses kicking in instantaneously, as presences both familiar and unfamiliar to some appeared on the aisle. Everyone, even a now awake Amalthea, found their attentions turning to what had cast the shadows. The collective eyes of all Rhea's children, Zeus included, along with Metis, Amalthea and Styx's offspring, widening in varying levels of shock and awe, as the gaze laid upon the towering forms of 300 armed, 50-headed, grey-skinned behemoths so gigantic they made the very mountain they slept within look small by comparison. All 3 of them standing at thousands of meters tall, with dense, thick muscle covering every inch of the ginormous frames, making them look that much more imposing. The 3 gigantic beings holding onto the arm of another in a sort of semicircle formation, and held atop one of the open hands of each 100-armed giant near their chests, with a titan-sized cyclops. One on the hand of the left, and the other 2 on the hand of the one on the right. For a moment, no one really said anything. Merely standing or sitting there in awe of the trio of massive multi-limbed and headed giants, not knowing what to make of them. It was brief, however, as it didn't take long for a familiar voice to make itself known. "Well, long time no see, everyone." Beerus shouted amusedly from his own perch beside Styx atop the biggest Hecatoncheia in the middle's hand. A wide smirk across his face as he stepped forward and leaned over the open hand down at them. "Guess who's returned with some new, and might I say, quite powerful allies?" "Fuck me," Poseidon blurted out, his jaw wide open as he felt the immense pressure of power exuded from the 3 gargantuan 100-handed ones alone, as he and everyone just continued stared up in marvel. "Is that them? Are those Gaea's sons? The ones that were locked up in that Tartarus place?" Rhea, having seen her giant brothers before numerous times in the past, wasn't dumbstruck in the least seeing their enormous forms again. She simply gave another pride-filled smile up at her eldest son, as she affirmed what her younger son had just muttered. "Yes. That's all right. The Hecatoncheias and Cyclopes in the flesh. Quite the sight to behold, aren't they?" "They certainly are, Mother." Demeter stared up just as all her siblings did, quite speechless at the giants before them now. She was pretty sure she wasn't the only one in the camp thinking about how unsightly the bigger sons of Gaea in particular looked, but she chose not to voice her displeasure, as that would have just been rude. "Good grief, those 3 are beyond hideous," Hera thought inwardly, an expression of disgust painting her face despite her best efforts to hide it. There's no denying, however, that they're strong though. This pressure they're all putting off just standing there is so immense. It's unlike anything I've felt so far. Even Beerus felt like a bug compared to these 3, which cemented home what Gaea had been saying about them to hype them up before they'd even done anything. It didn't take long for her current expression to shift, however, once she focused more so on her elder brother perched atop the hand of the middle one looking down at them. Her disgusted look quickly becoming much more sly and devious, something no one noticed given they were far more preoccupied staring up at the humongous entities that Beerus had brought back for them. "Ah. Fresh air again? I'd forgotten what this felt like." The Hecatoncheia holding Beerus and Styx rumbled pleasantly, as he felt it graze off his mountainous frame. His head tilting up to the sunny sky as his fellow 100-handed ones, along with the Cyclopes in their hands, nodded in agreement, as they soaked it all in. They'd only been out here for a few seconds now, but already, they were starting to feel the true bliss that came with freedom. Though there was a notable hint of confusion that came over his massive features. How strange though, I do not recall that chariot and being far up above in the heavens emitting that massive ball of hot light the last time any of us were out here. Massive ball of hot light. Is he referring to the sun? Beerus did well to not show utter befuddlement at the middle Hecatonchire's baffling statement. Ah, he's new. Or, well, new compared to the last time you guys were free, I should say. Styx piped up, grabbing all three giants' attention, given they could all easily hear her with their huge ears. His name's Helios. He's only out during Hemera's daytime, and that huge ball of light and heat he seems to appear as, you can call it the sun, if you'd prefer. Ah, I see. The trio of hundred-handed ones nodded in understanding at this, and Beerus had to sweat drop a little. These three had really last been out in a time before the sun was even a thing at all. Geez, even for him, trying to imagine what a daytime would look like without a sun just sounded downright bizarre. It looks pretty. Not as nice to look at as all the stars out during Nyx's nighttime, but he's definitely a nice addition to the day. You should see the night as well. Styx added with a helpful, small smile. His sister Selene looks absolutely radiant up in the sky with her lunar rays coming down. She's become what some of us like to call the moon, and in my honest opinion, she's just as dazzling, if not more so, than her brother. Although I must say, Eos isn't far behind either of them, and sometimes her dawn can look even more stunning than either of her siblings at the best. Moon and dawn, huh? The Hecatonchire on the left muttered, though given how massive he was, even that traveled far throughout the island. Damn, quite a bit has changed since we were thrown into Tartarus. True, but this means there's new stuff for you to experience now that you're no longer huddled away in that cavern. Styx said sympathetically while looking around at all three Hecatonchires. What she says is correct. Beerus cut in with a small smirk, leaving aside them having been around prior to several things he would have thought would have been present since the early days of this strange world. You're all free again after all, he continued, having their full attention but not once looking back as he brought his fists behind his waist and touched them together. His gaze instead focused on the mountain where he could make out a certain primordial goddess's presence, as his voice rose loud enough for all to hear. So alongside helping me, you have all the time in the world to do as you will. And what better way to start that off, than having a little reunion with the very being that wanted me to rescue you all in the first place. Isn't that right, Gia? The 300 armed giants, as well as the 3 cyclopes stilled. The gazes shifting over completely to where Beerus was now looking out to, as they heard his exclamation. All of the collective eyes zoning down on 2 figures perched near the top of a mountain not even half as big as the Hecatonchires were. One being a naked goat nymph laid down that they didn't recognize, staring up at them with her mouth open in genuine shock and a bit of revulsion. Something they were all too used to. The other, however, was someone they all absolutely recognized, and could never forget. Her practically nude, voluptuous body shaking as she stared up at them. Not with fear, or with any sense of disgust like most did, but with genuine relief and unparalleled joy, as her eyes began to water. My boys, she said softly. So softly that only the Hecatonchires and Beerus to a much lesser extent could pick it up. Her lips trembling with tears of happiness cascading down her cheeks as she laid eyes on her 6 sons that she hadn't seen for so many years. A sob escaping her as she brought her hands up to her mouth, unable to control the torrent of emotions currently running through her. It wasn't any better for the 6 former prisoners of Tartarus. For when they all saw the face of the dear mother again and saw the tears she was shedding for their return, nothing else around them mattered. All other thoughts ceased in their minds, as none of them could help their eyes beginning to water either at her presence before them. All of them looking like they were beginning to choke up at the sight of the crying goddess, as something in their throats hitched, particularly with the trio of hundred-handed ones. Their huge bodies also beginning to shake, something that was felt over the entire island like a small earthquake, making several of those down below nearly stumble from the rumbling earth beneath their feet. Mother, the Hecatonchire holding both Beerus and Styx muttered, his deep voice cracking as he laid eyes on the one being that had ever truly showed him and his brethren kindness. Had ever showed them love, rather than disgust. The only being to have truly cared about them and not look upon them like they were freaks at all, but rather happy additions to her life that she cherished with all her heart. Not to mention was the main reason their rescuers Beerus and Styx had even come to get them at all. The only being that could get the divine hearts to seize up and pang with a waterfall of happy and sad emotions. The former for seeing her again, and the latter for having been separated for so long they had no idea how long had truly passed since they were damned to the pit for the second time. Beerus, I think it's best we got off now. Styx remarked as she moved close to Beerus, placing a hand on his shoulder as she read the room, so to speak, and understood what was about to happen. And I think you know why. She allowed herself to have a more tender smile as she glanced around at both the faces of Gear's now free children, and the Earth Mother herself. Beerus simply shrugged, having nothing to say to that as he too sensed the mushy scene about to take place. Without any further deliberation, Beerus with Styx in tow teleported off the middle Hecatonchire's hand and reappeared down by his own siblings and mother, leaving his new allies to have their proper reunion with their parent. This turned out to be a good decision, as no sooner had they done this, did everyone below with them witness the primordial goddess leaping right off where she stood, somehow shaking the isle to its very foundations as she went airborne. And it wasn't any meager jump either. No, it was more like a sky-bound thrust that sent her a solid kilometer up. And as she was, her size began to undertake a massive increase. Her huge honkers wobbling and jiggling around as they along with the rest of her became drastically bigger in the blink of an eye. Thus, leaving all those beneath other than Rhea, along with Beerus and Styx to a much lesser extent utterly dumbstruck with eyes wide like saucers, as her now towering frame soared overhead. Amalthea's was the most pronounced, as her eyes all but bugged out of her skull as she felt the isle shake beneath her and watched Gear become gargantuan as she launched toward the gigantic muscle-bound figures. The protogenos of the earth and life reaching the same size easily as the Hecatonchires. Her arms opened wide and inviting as she all but flew towards the middle Hecatonchire. Mother. All three Hecatonchires shouted out with tears of pure joy falling down their faces, all of their faces, and the Cyclopes weren't any better, as their mother crashed into the middle hundred-hander. Her now truly mind-boggling, titanic breasts squishing against some of the other faces of the tallest hundred-hander with a near-deafeningly loud boing as she wrapped her arms around his mane head first. Almost knocking the trio of multi-limbed and headed giants over as her feet planted onto the ground, covering over half a kilometer by themselves and quaking Crete even harder than before. Briareus, Cottus, Gidges. It's been far too long. Gia cried out with an overjoyed, teary expression, gaining the single greatest smile of happiness she'd probably ever had as all 300-handers circled their arms around her. Briareus, the middle one, using pretty much all of them save for two to hug his mom back, while Cottus on the left and Gidges on the right closed in and wrapped 50 of their arms around her shapely figure. All of them having similar expressions to their mother as they took part in a group hug, letting the tears flow down freely from all of their humongous, and most would call unsightly faces. To Gia though, these were her beautiful sons. Always had been. Always would be. What? Don't tell me you forgot about us, Ma. We were stuck in that shithole too. One of the Cyclopes yelled out, as they all hopped up high unto their mother's shoulders. Tears falling from all their single eyes too, but each holding an unmistakable grin of cheerfulness that they had not felt in a long time now that they were in their maternal parents' presence once more. Gia's eyes turned to look at the Cyclops that had spoken on her left shoulder, the other two being on her right. Her teary smile that she afforded being the kind only a proud, loving mother could have when seeing her long-lost sons finally come home. Oh, I could never forget about any of you, Arges. I'm beside myself right now, seeing you. She turned her head slightly and looked to her other shoulder with glittering pools from all the tears being shed. Brontes and Steropes again too. Don't you ever think otherwise, she sniffled, as the three Cyclopes stretched their arms wide and hugged the sides of her neck, chuckling to themselves as their tears stained her sublime skin. You have no idea how sorry I am that I let you all go through that horrid imprisonment down in Tartarus. For the second time no less. I've been such an awful mother to you all for allowing that to happen. It's okay, Ma. You shouldn't blame yourself for that. For either of them. It was Dad and Kronos that put us down there, not you. Arges replied soothingly, gaining a nod of agreement from all of her formerly imprisoned sons. I'll be honest, some of us were losing hope you'd ever do something to help us, but in the end you did. You got some folks to go in and get us out, rather than leave us to rot like other members of our so-called family did. One could literally feel every ounce of bitterness and hate that came through his tone when speaking of two individuals in particular. His cadence quickly shifted back to a more relaxed and happy air, tinged with a bit of somberness. You're not awful. Not at all. You're the only one who's ever really been good to us, and I know no one here will argue with me on that. The black-haired Cyclops was proven correct when no one made to do so. Instead, once again motioning their heads in agreement as they continued to hug her sniffling form. Something that only made Gia's divine heart flutter with the purest jubilation as she wept over Briaroy's shoulder. Soaking in every bit of the embrace her long and wrongfully imprisoned children were giving her. Though she'd never shown it, there had been an inkling in her before that her sons might resent her somewhat for allowing such a fate to befall them and had been ready to bear the brunt of it, so long as they were all free. For that was what truly mattered to her. Instead, she was being given the comfort of none of them holding anything against her, and she could feel just how much they all loved her back by the way they warmly hugged her close, almost as if they were just as much afraid that she'd simply disappear in a snap just as she was to them. Oh, my dear, sweet boys, I'm so glad to have you all back. She muttered with more conviction than most mothers could ever even dream of mustering up for their own spawn. The weight behind each of those simple words being felt by all present, not just the trio of Hecatonchias and Cyclopes. Good to be back, Mother. And this time, we damn sure aren't going to let ourselves be thrown back into the pit. That's a promise. Briareus spoke from the heart for all of them, as he deepened his hug with her, holding her now gigantic figure about as close as he possibly could into his multi-headed chest, damn near suffocating some of them in copious amounts of her spongy boob flesh, but he didn't care. His brothers followed suit, giving about the tightest embrace they could to show their immense affection toward the primordial goddess that had birthed them all and stuck up for them when no one else other than themselves would. Damn, I knew there'd be some waterworks once they reunited, but this is a bit much. Hades muttered with a near-comical sweat drop as he and everyone else below heard the wet thud that each falling teardrop made from the super-sized gear and the Hecatonchias. His deep black eyes watching as all of them splashed down on the ground, each tear being multiple times larger than any of them currently were, and had quickly formed very sizable puddles on the ground where they fell down on. Yeah, at this rate, they may just flood the whole island with their tears alone, Poseidon semi-joked with a small sweat drop of his own and a light chuckle as he massaged his beard. Just on this one occasion being a bit more tactful and not taking the easy opportunity to get a nice gander at the now giant-sized goddess' plump ass. Because given the circumstance, even he knew that would have just been in poor taste. No matter wonderful of a sight it may have been for him. Come on, guys, don't be so mean, Demeter commented in rebuttal as she briefly glanced over at the two, not quite catching on to Poseidon's less than serious cadence, nor the fact that Hades meant no ill behind his words either. The straw-blonde beauty smiling happily for Gia as she looked back up, and while she was put off by the Hecatonchia's appearance in particular, she couldn't deny what she was witnessing was a rather heartwarming scene. This is their first time seeing each other in a long time. No doubt way longer than when we were separated from Mom. I think it's only natural they'd all be this emotional about it. You're absolutely right, Demeter. Rhea agreed with her middle daughter, wiping a few stray tears from her own eyes seeing her own mother so full of emotion and weeping her heart out with joy. She didn't even attempt to scold her two sons though, for she could tell neither meant anything bad by it. If there's one being who's had to put up with heartache over the treatment of her own children more than I have, it's my mother. She, more than anyone else, really needed this, and watching her right now, I don't think I've ever seen her happier than she is now with those 6 brothers of mine free again. Hestia nodded in wholehearted agreement, her glowing eyes shining with pleasure seeing the Earth Mother so ecstatic as she was cuddled by her 6 sons. All who clearly loved her deeply. Hades and Poseidon merely shrugged, having nothing to disagree with on that front. Zeus and Metis were of similar minds as well as they too came closer to the rest of the group. The former of which being in the same boat as Poseidon and controlling his more perverted urge to ogle the primordial goddess shapely Rhea out of respect for the tender moment she was getting. One that was long overdue. Hera was pretty much the only one who'd stopped paying the Earth Mother and her released kin any mind. This wasn't to say she didn't feel good for Gia getting this moment, she was just much more focused on her approaching brother flanked by Styx. I'll have to second that, Rhea. Styx remarked with a smaller, but easily noticeable smile of her own, as she and Beerus moved closer to the rest. Lady Gia has put up with more grief than most, or probably anyone else in this world. As a mother myself, seeing her like this now with her long-lost children is enough to almost make me tear up as well. I'm glad me and Beerus were able to give her this moment. So, I take it that means you both fully succeeded in both ventures, Mother? Nike asked respectfully with a pleasant smile, as she and her other siblings seemingly made their way over to their own maternal parent in a flash. Kratos around her on her left, with Zealous and Beer on her right. HMPH. What do you think? Beerus smirked, answering for the eldest Oceanid. We sent that buffoon Hyperion and his little mistress on a fruitless chase far away from here before we fished those 6 out. It was almost too easy making the former do exactly what I wanted him to. He's not wrong. Beerus was able to manipulate Hyperion's rage and hate against him to his own advantage and got him to pursue us without going into his true divine form. It made the whole affair a whole lot easier than I was expecting it to be. Styx He's not wrong. Beerus was able to manipulate Hyperion's rage and hate against him to his own advantage and got him to pursue us without going into his true divine form. It made the whole affair a whole lot easier than I was expecting it to be. Styx complimented her partner's efforts with an appreciative nod. And what of Tartarus? Did you run into any resistance down there that you had to push through in order to get those 6 out? Bea asked curiously this time, motioning up at the Hecatonchias and Cyclopes with her head as she propped her hands on her hips. A little. There was indeed a monster named Camp guarding the pit they were holed up in. But Beerus dealt with her rather swiftly with just a single blow. Blew her head to bits right in front of us all without much effort. Tartarus may have actually been an even easier affair than having Hyperion and Thea pursuing us, truth be told. Fascinating. Bea's forceful gaze centered on Beerus with a wide smile at how he dealt with the monster by her mother's account. No talk of him having talked this monster down or tried to be more diplomatic, just straight up using force to get what he wanted. Now that, she liked. Serving under him was going to be fun. In any case, mission accomplished. Not that it was ever going to be anything else. Beerus shrugged with a somewhat cocky expression, bringing the attention of everyone below to him. Now once their little reunion is finished, I'm getting back to my training, which'll include checking up on you lot each with those spars I promised. I do hope I'll get to see some good stuff out of all of you. I believe you will, dear brother. Hestia said with hopeful cheer in her voice, more than pleased to see her younger twin back with nary a hitch and everything having gone the way they wanted it to. Her form making its way to him quickly, and giving him a tender, welcoming hug back of his own. Her clothed breasts squishing into his front as she wrapped her arms fondly around his waist. Her warm, homely aura blazing over him and making him relax tenfold and eradicating any awkwardness he would have otherwise felt. His divine body instinctually pulling his fists away from each other and circling his arms around her as well without even a second thought. It is good to see you back safe and sound, Beerus. Hey, she made it sound like there was even a chance that he wouldn't come back. Beerus would have rolled his eyes at such a statement had it not been Hestia who was saying it to him. Good to be back, I suppose. He replied while patting her back. An affectionate act like several others that he seemed to be quite comfortable doing with her now, as opposed to some time back. He barely even felt any awkwardness anymore, at least when it came to reciprocating the favor to his new twin with this wonderfully soothing aura of hers flowing over him. Whilst in this embrace, Beerus's eyes roamed over the rest of his assembled siblings who were all giving him varying looks of respect and cheerfulness seeing him back as promised. Hades in particular already looking excited about getting to spar with him soon enough. He could see it written all over his face, just how giddy he was to get to that, despite his best efforts to keep himself contained. When his gaze went over his mother Rhea, she had perhaps the most well-pleased expression and beaming smile he'd seen so far with his and Styx's work today as she locked eyes with her oldest son, giving him a proud, parental nod for what he'd done as she folded her arms beneath her ample bosom. And given he was in quite the good mood, plus Hestia's influence, he had no qualms giving her a nod back. Metis likewise looked quite pleased herself that everything had turned out perfectly fine. She caught Zeus's gaze on her for that brief moment, and the knowing smirk he was giving, as if saying without words, I told you so. Something she couldn't help but lightly chuckle at as he and she came within 10 feet of the returning duo. Her worry over them and what may have happened being completely alleviated by their presence here. As Beerus finally separated from Hestia however, his gaze landed on the eerily smiling face of Hera, as she closed the distance between. A bit of swagger to her wide hips and gait that Beerus noticed almost immediately, as did most of the others. A quirked eyebrow being raised by the soon-to-be god of destruction as she strode over and stopped less than a foot away from him as Hestia stepped to the side, giving enough room for her to get in front but being close enough to easily reach out. Both curious of their sister's intentions more than a little bit for different reasons. "Something you need, Hera?" Beerus asked, feeling that something was off. The beatific fledgling goddess' smile only broadened a tad as she brought her arms up, and for a brief instant, Beerus with a bit of surprise thought she was coming in for a hug as well as her hands came up near his neck. He was proven very wrong, however, when instead her hands placed themselves gently, but firmly on his cheeks, something that gave him a feeling of déjà vu. He looked at her even more strangely at her behavior and was about to ask her what the heck she was even doing. That small bit of hesitation born from his confusion over what she was doing might as well have kicked him up the ass, because as fast as the wind, she had risen up almost on her tiptoes and fully closed the distance between their two faces. Her soft lips pressing right into his as she tilted her head slightly, stunning everyone and making them widen their eyes as she took a page out of Demeter's book, and kissed him right there and then. Beerus was perhaps the worst of the lot, as his eyes shot wide open to such a degree one would have thought this was part of a comedic Saturday cartoon, as his throat made a guttural, practically stupefied sound from the sudden lip lock. His features showing an expression of shock that eclipsed what he'd had when Demeter had done the same, as she deepened the kiss rather than pull away. His own lips, which had been parted partially beforehand, were his undoing as Hera took it a step further than her sister had, and daringly shoved her slippery tongue right inside his mouth without a hint of shame or hesitancy. Her sharp hazel eyes glaring right into his without wavering once as she, while totally unexperienced in this sort of thing, explored his more for what it was worth with her moist appendage, wrestling a bit with his own immobile pink muscle as well. The actions were by no means subtle either. They were loud enough for those closest to actually hear what her tongue was doing, gliding and sliding about over his gums and morsel of flesh, and just about everyone, even the giants up above, could hear her cheeky moan midway through it all. Gia and her sons had even separated a little just to look down at what was going on, and watched, in Gia's case exclusively with the kind of teasing smile that Beerus would have despised as Hera smothered his lips with her own. She deepened the smooch as far as she could go by pressing into him with her own body for maximum effect, never taking her eyes off his now pinprick-sized pupils as her supple mounds flattened against his chest when she then wrapped one of her arms completely around his head. The other circling round as her dainty hand grabbed his purple locks tightly by the back of his head to keep him locked in place. Going so far as to lift one of her curvy legs, keeping it bent as she placed it against the side of his thigh. The former god of Universe 7 being too shell-shocked once again to do anything in that moment she'd caught him. One could almost make the case he was spellbound in a sense, as she ran her wet appendage over just about every place she could, grazing around his tonsils damn near with her efforts. If Beerus had thought Demeter's kiss was inappropriate, then this one blew it right out of the water, being about as over the top as it could get, and was inflamed with just as much non-familial passion, if not more so, than the blondes had. The kiss lasted almost 3 times as long as her sister's had before she finally relented, pulling away from the shell-shocked Beerus's lips with a string of saliva connecting hers to his. One of, no, the most smug, self-satisfied grin she'd ever held being etched over her gorgeous features, as she stared triumphantly into the purple-haired deity's stunned eyes. "What's with that look, Beerus? Why so surprised?" she asked facetiously with a tone full of amusement at his gobsmacked face, knowing full well what the answer was. Ha. Everyone around them was speechless for different reasons. Their three brothers just openly stared in shock at what had just happened, totally not expecting Hera of all people to do what she just did. Demeter's jaw was almost as unhinged as Beerus's own after seeing how aggressively she'd assaulted his mouth, making the one she'd give seem like barely a peck by comparison. Hestia was wide-eyed and didn't know what to think with her sister's actions, while Rhea in the back was smiling ear to ear at her daughter's ballsy move and was downright impressed by the fact that she'd gone the whole distance with it. Styx and her four children merely blinked in a small bit of astonishment, having not foreseen that happening, with Metis being much the same. Seeing the exact reaction that she'd been hoping for, Hera, perhaps a little sexily licked her lips, breaking apart the mixed saliva and tasting it in her mouth. She then purposefully slid her foot behind his legs while he was rooted still and swept one of his feet right out from under him as she brought her arms away and gave him a small shove. The act easily sending him tumbling to the ground on his ass. His eyes still staring up at her even then with his jaw unhinged as he tried, and failed, to come up with any thought in that small period of time. All he could do, was bring one shaky hand up to his still wet lips with amber pools full of almost comical horror, as though he'd been shot, as she leaned down with the front half of her body and gazed at him with pure mirth. Letting out a gratified giggle at his perfectly astounded expression as though that was her trophy for a good job done. That makes us even now, Beerus. She remarked, stuck on a total high after what she'd done, almost to the point of pure arousal, as she looked down at the dumbstruck god. I would say that I hope you liked that little reward for your efforts, but she glanced down almost mockingly before meeting his dumbfounded eyes again. I think it's pretty clear to everyone here how much a certain part of you enjoyed that. She winked with a victorious smirk, placing her hands on her hips as she rose back up to her full height. Looking forward to that spar of yours, by the way. I'm sure you'll try to bring your A game. Just try not to disappoint me, okay? As I said before, I have very high standards. She repeated what she'd told him before, only with an added sense of confidence as if she held dominance over him and he was the one who had to show her what he'd learned, not the other way around, as she turned away from him. Before everyone's eyes, she strutted off satisfactorily with an extra sway to her hips, something that managed to get her perfectly round booty to show more through her tunic right before Beerus's stunned eyes, possibly to mock him further. The fledgling deity, shaking as a whirlwind of emotions, most of them volatile, began to war within him as he watched her cockily saunter away from him. It was only just as his mind was getting his faculties right, and the mental repulsion began to kick in, that her words from earlier replayed in his head. Almost timidly, he tilted his head down and looked at where she'd flicked her eyes to before. And when he saw the huge tent that had formed from a clear erection, the internal scream that echoed through his inner being almost came out full force in a deafening external one that would have been heard for countless miles over. Hell, it probably could have pierced into different dimensions had it been unleashed. As it were, only a croaked sound came out of Beerus's open maw, as he stared with increasing balefulness at his new accursed body's reaction to Hera's little stunt. When everyone else's gaze began to shift back to him, not quite knowing what to say, other than perhaps Rhea, who was beaming so hard it physically hurt to look at her, Beerus latched onto his lips with a grip so hard he almost tore that part of his face clean off. Only one singular thought running through his mind succinctly and clearly, as the urge to castrate himself shot through the roof and into the stratosphere metaphorically. One that summed up what had just occurred pretty well. What the fuck? The Olympian god of destruction. Chapter 15. The Titanomachy VIII. Atop Mount O3s. So, my son, how goes the recruitment of those allying with us against the upstarts? Iapetus asked pointedly from within the Titan's joint throne room as he massaged his beard. It has gone well, father. Atlas nodded with a somewhat pleased look. Almost everyone we expected to fall in line and support our side in this has done so. There are only a select few that remain which haven't yet. Though I am hopeful they will make the right choice, and not side with Cronus' wayward children over us. The same sadly cannot be said for some of those who didn't agree with how we did things, as Pallas has unfortunately brought to our attention with his wife Styx and their children's allegiances. I can only hope that others of a similar mind do not make the same mistake that she and his spawn have and keep themselves out of this conflict, for Tartarus is the only thing that awaits those warring against us. Should they avoid our Lord's deadly scythe, of course. And what of those neutral to this already? Have any shown some sway in their opinion? Like Hyperion and Thea's kids for example. Not that I'm aware of. The muscle-bound Titan shook his head. If any of them had, I'm sure that either my uncle or aunt would have hurried back here to warn us by now of a strange occurrence with them. For their parents especially, it'd be quite easy to tell if any one of their 3 children had come down to the earth while they're out flying through the heavens. As for others, besides Lady Gia, who were certain is helping the other side conceal themselves at this point, the other protogenoi have still not made so much as a peep of support to either our side or theirs. It's safe to assume they'll continue to remain neutral for this too, as expected. And we both know what your eldest brother thought on aligning with us when asked. Yes, Iapetus seemed to cringe slightly, recalling the emphatic refusal his brother had given when they'd asked of him to join him, once he'd confirmed he had nothing to do with hiding Beerus and his siblings away from them. The Titan god of the endless ocean making it clear his feelings towards his fellow Titan kin was no different than it was all those millennia back when he'd refused to join them in taking down their father. Tethys was no different either, considering the silent but unimpressed stare she'd given him upon asking. A part of me, I must admit, feels a bit of shame that Oceanus and Tethys are still refusing to cooperate with us, but then again, I can't really say I expected much else from them. Iapetus sighed. They've pretty much made it clear they want nothing to do with us anymore and would rather be left alone in their kingdom far beneath the ocean floor. About the only good news out of that, is that they want no part of the conflict period. Yes, I agree. For as much as you, Lord Kronos and my other uncles have railed on him for not joining you in the overthrowing of your father, it cannot be denied that if he alone were to get involved and side against us, that would become very troublesome. Though most of them referred to their eldest brother in particular as a coward for not joining his father and uncles on that fateful day, the one thing that couldn't be denied, even by Kronos if asked, was that Oceanus held immense power that easily rivaled his brethren, and Tethys wasn't far behind. If the two of them got involved, it could spell some serious problems for them, and perhaps even sway the opinion of some of their other allies to switch sides, which was why it was a bit of a blessing all the same that neither wanted any part in the war to be had. Troublesome indeed. His father agreed, as he gained a somewhat consternated look. Though not quite as troublesome as what occurred last week. I must say, I did not expect our father's brief return, and his words of blight to Kronos have drummed up his perturbation even further than it was before. Indeed. I don't think I've ever seen Lord Kronos look so enraged and fearful at the same time. Atlas looked away uncertainly for a moment. Their lord had done his best to hide the latter emotion from them, but none of his brothers or he had failed to catch the flame of fear in his eyes after what he described as a cloudy visit from Uranos. He'd looked ready to lash out at just about everything around him after the primordial god of the heavens had spared him some, suffice to say, unpleasant words. I'm sure that our bastard father was just trying to get in his head. It's quite clear that he favors the newer generation over us purely because their victory would mean Kronos' dethronement, and no doubt a trip down to Tartarus where he would prefer we all were in right now. Iapetus spat balefully, having not a slither of love or respect for the Heavenly Father that had helped in their inception, and then tried to shove them down into the pit's deepest depths out of disgust at them, despite their mother's pained protests. I personally don't buy his so-called prophecy, even for a moment. I'm sure it was just a tactic of that senile old fool to scare Kronos and make him doubt himself. Nothing more. We couldn't agree more. Father and son turned as Koyos and We couldn't agree more. Father and son turned as Koyos and Krios entered the throne room with curious expressions. The former of which being the one to speak. Speaking of our little brother though, where is he? Me and Krios have been meaning to discuss some things with him, mainly pertaining to what our plan of attack will be in case our enemy is able to build themselves up enough to be a genuine threat to us. We felt his presence leave O3s a few minutes ago, and we were just wondering if either of you knew where he went. Krios asked, looking more so towards Atlas than his father, given he'd felt the younger Titan's presence being closer to the Titan Lords before vanishing suddenly without a trace. Atlas's expression became one of confusion then, as he regarded both his uncles with a light scratching of his beard. No. I can't say that I do. My back was to him when he suddenly dematerialized. I didn't think much of it though. He shrugged before gaining a more neutral look. He's probably just gone somewhere to ease his mind and he'll be back soon enough. My guess is he's probably with a nymph that's caught his fancy. I do recall him telling me a while back that he had an Oceanid he had grown a particular interest for named Phalera who lives in Mount Pelion, so he's probably gone there. He left that suddenly to go and sample a nymph. Koyos rose a brow. It didn't sound completely out of character for Kronos to do so, given he laid with his fair share like they all had, but to go and do so in a situation like this without saying anything first. If this were any other time, I could see that happening. But now, when he's been so determined and laser-focused on finding his eldest son and the rest of his and Rhea's children, that seems a tad bit too unlikely, Atlas. As I said, he could have gone to clear his mind. All this stress that I can tell has been adding up on him since that bastard Beerus punched a hole through in his stomach, to more recently with Uranos' visit. It wouldn't shock me if he needed to have a little fun in order to calm himself after everything he's been dealing with so far. The muscle-bound Titan maintained his position, believing it to be a fairly solid explanation. He then gained a somewhat cheeky grin as he crossed his arms. I'll put it to you this way, if he comes back here as a stallion, then he's definitely been with that Oceanid I just mentioned. That's the form he came back here in last time he'd been with her. Ha. Oh yeah, I remember that. Krios laughed, recalling that day with some mirth. I believe he said he'd taken that form to avoid Rhea annoying him if she managed to catch them in the act, and a horse was just the first thing he thought of while he was taking her from behind. Apparently left that Oceanid in a pretty delirious and messy state by the time he was done. Iapetus cracked a very small, almost unnoticeable, humid smile on his pale visage. Not entirely surprising, given the state he's left Rhea in the past. Perhaps with her off the table, he may well have just gone down to this other mistress of his for another round. He has been fairly wound up as of late, so I can definitely buy what my son suggests. Koios seemed to relax a bit at that, though didn't seem fully convinced. Alright then, I guess I'll just wait here for him too. In that instant, golden specks coalesced near the four gathered titans, and before long, the Titan Lord reappeared in the room. And once he did, the smiles that almost everyone had fell away immediately once they saw how tense he was. His divine aura waving frantically over his body and making space-time warp arrhythmically around him in a mixture of red and gold, with his trusty scythe clutched in one hand that was gripping it like a vice. His eyes were glowing a furious shade of red, but there was an undeniable sign of panic on his face, and perhaps, a hint of horror. Gone, the gone. He shouted violently after a moment, putting his three brother and nephew on high alert as his power flexed harder, making the whole room warp around him as space itself spasmed under his temperament. Gone. Atlas blinked, remarkably the least affected by Kronos' power surge despite being the youngest there. There was clear befuddlement on his features, as there was on his father's and uncle's faces. Who's gone, my lord? No sooner had those words left his lips, did Kronos snap his molten, red-eyed gaze right to his face, as he glared at him with gritted teeth. Almost snarling like a beast as his voice boomed throughout the entire stronghold. The seal that I made to keep those ugly bastards in the pit has been broken. You don't mean? Iapetus caught on quick as to whom his brother was referring to before it was even said, and Krios and Koios weren't long to follow either, as their expressions took a steep downturn. Though theirs were more like a grimace compared to the downright infuriated and slightly fearful look etched over the youngest brother's features. I felt it disappear mere minutes ago and flashed down to that damned pit as fast as I could, but all I saw when I arrived was the headless body of that useless monster camp I left to guard them, my barrier destroyed, and worst of all, Kronos looked like he wanted to scream as veins popped out of his neck and around his face. Rage swirling through him as much as space and time were swirling helplessly around his shimmering frame, as the rumbling of the sky picked up again. The sign of Urano's disembodied laughter echoing around him as he delivered the news that made him want to tear his own skin off. The Hecatonchias and the Cyclopes were gone. They've been freed from Tartarus. And the worst part was, he just damn well knew who was responsible for such a thing. Iapetus summed up the thoughts of those who knew what that meant, particularly when it pertained to their hundred-handed giant brothers, with just the utterance of a single word. One packed with about as much exasperation as had probably ever been heard coming from his mouth by his kin. All while looking up at the ceiling as if he was boring a hole through it to his body less farther and glaring right at him as though he'd played a part in it. Fuck. Back on Crete, later that day. Grr. A fist plowed right into Poseidon's sternum, breaking several ribs with a harsh crunch as the tanned fledgling god was sent hurtling back, bouncing off the ground and ripping chunks of earth off as he went. Ichor spilling in rivulets from his maw as he careened a good mile back in under a trillionth of a second before a purple-hued frame flashed right in his path and grabbed him by the face with a single hand. The action halting his body's momentum and making his tree-trunk thick legs fly up uselessly behind the toned, muscular arm of the one who'd stopped him, before he was unceremoniously slammed down skull first into the hard, magic-infused ground. The back of his head forming a deep, wide crater that spanned out a solid 15 feet around and 10 feet gaping down as the entire isle shook from the impact. Not good enough, Poseidon. A defense that pathetic will get you nowhere. Beerus almost growled, looking thoroughly pissed off as he wrenched his dazed brother out of the crater, hopping up into the air as he left him dizzily floating before spinning around so fast, he looked like a tornado before he drilled him in the chest with a vicious kick using the sole of his foot. The younger of the two feeling every bit of air and sputum mixed with ichor getting knocked out of his mouth as the bones of his chest were caved in before his ribs, or his skull for that matter, even had time to recover. A large shockwave billowing forth as he was yet again sent flying away with a deep dent around his sturdy chest. The tanned god groaned when his body came to a stop after smashing hard into the mountain they slept inside with an ear-popping thud. The impact almost hard enough to bring the whole thing down on him, Gear's durability enhancing magic be damned. His frame forming a body-shaped crater in the center of a much deeper one that sent splinters and cracks all over the section of the quaking mountain he'd struck into with his back. You'll need to be a lot sharper than that if you want to make an impression on me. I think your recent luck with our mother has made you a bit too cocky for your own good. Beerus barked with a none too pleasant air, as his form flickered into existence just a few short meters in front of him. Poseidon managed to slink his way out of the crater he'd been smashed into, falling to his knees immediately with a rough, bloody cough. If it wasn't obvious enough already, Beerus was keeping to his word and giving each of his siblings a spar against him. The first of which, rather unfortunately for the second youngest sibling of the lot, was him. Unfortunate, because he was getting his brother pretty much right after Hera had pulled her little stunt on him, and Beerus clearly wasn't in a good mood about it. One he hadn't made any better, to be fair. Following Hera's little get back, as she'd called it, Beerus had left them all for a short while with an expression stuck between weirdly horror-struck and downright furious. Although the latter was more so at himself, it seemed, what with the fact he'd been glaring daggers down at the huge tent that had formed after Hera had basically given him a snog so strong and inflamed that it made sounded as raw and raunchy as it looked. When he'd returned a little while later after storming off like with Demeter before, he'd come back with a similarly ill-tempered expression, though a good bit more controlled. Like he was calming down after what had happened, and already looked to have set his sights on Hera for the first spar. That was, of course, until he'd caught wind of his stupid mouth muttering with a snicker behind his hand in response to Hades after he'd remarked on their brother's behavior with some concern for how perturbed he looked even after coming back shortly from whatever he'd done. Something that Hestia as well had been quick to double up on, seeing his severely off-put visage. And then there'd been him, the one to catch his brother's attention with a joke he regretted uttering, given Beerus had heard him. One where he'd quipped, and I quote, probably was just too hot and bothered after what Hera pulled on him and stormed off to relieve himself, away from any prying eyes. He'd even been bold enough to insinuate with a subtle gesture of his hand by his crotch exactly what he meant by relieve, thinking the whole situation Hera had caused with him, and his following reaction, was pretty humorous. Just as he had with his brother's previous reaction to Demeter's little kiss. Suffice to say, he didn't think Beerus had ever bored a hole through him with a glare so potent before, making it clear that he hadn't seen the humor in it at all. And before he knew it, Beerus had selected him as the first of their siblings he'd spar with. The others being moved to a different area after Beerus had made it clear that they'd need the space. The spar had been going on for a couple minutes at this point, with Poseidon mainly going with some decent usage of dematerialization and hand to start off. So far it hadn't gone well for him. And well, he called this a spar, but really, so far, it had just been Beerus countering anything he'd tried with ease and then trouncing him for his mistakes before making a snapping critique on what he should have done better. Basically, a more extreme version of what he'd done with Zeus, but without Poseidon actually getting any of his own back yet. Though quite nervous now, the younger brother didn't let this deter him and shot up from his kneeling position right at Beerus, already sending a sharp punch sailing towards his face. One that the purple-haired deity narrowed his amber eyes on before skillfully batting it away with one hand and then sending a punch with his other toward Poseidon's exposed cheek. The younger brother actually anticipated a counter like this though, and quickly shape-shifted into a small bird in order to float right over the skin of his knuckles. Beerus's hand from before then snapped back up to slap him away, only for him to time it just right and teleport to safety. He then reappeared right above his head in the form of a majestic white horse, with his two front hooves poised to stomp down on his brother's skull as his now bulky equine body glowed with a sea-green aura. Beerus, however, was by no means caught off guard by this smooth transition, turning his body to face the dropping horse form of his little brother and ducking his head to avoid the stomp with ease, showing a level of speed Poseidon wasn't quite prepared. His own body glowing with a dark purple aura as he brought his index and middle fingers together before shooting them up in rapid succession, striking 6 different points in the underbelly of his equine sibling, before flashing to the side in one graceful movement. His horse-transformed brother collapsing rather harshly to the soil with spittle and ichor flying out again with a neigh of shocked pain, stumbling and failing to get up on his legs after whatever his brother had done to him. Decent reflexes and an all-right plan of attack, but much too telegraphed to ever actually work against me. Beerus complimented in a rather backhanded way, as he glared down at his brother's form just as it shifted back to his normal state. Shit like that only worked on me back when I wasn't used to that kind of fighting, and I was holding back enough that Zeus could land despite his shoddy fighting technique at the time. You're better than he was then in terms of technique, I'll give you that, but not by much, and certainly not enough for you to land something like that on me. Ugh, noted, Poseidon wheezed, not missing the highly irritated tone Beerus held, as his body healed enough that he could move again. Mind telling me what you just did? He asked curiously, as he managed to get back up to his feet. Pressure points. Beerus replied, before reappearing right in Poseidon's face with a fist cocked back. And before you ask, no. I'm not in the mood to teach you that. He then struck out fast and furious, with Poseidon, perhaps through a miracle, managing to bend back and narrowly avoid having his face bashed inward. The younger sibling then tried to rally back by barely slipping under his brother's next punch and getting into a brief, but insanely fast exchange of punches and kicks with him afterward. The latter easily avoiding, parrying and blocking the former's, while the former struggled to do the same to the latter. Eventually though, Poseidon thought he saw an opening, and ducked low under one of Beerus's cutting fists, before popping right up like a wound spring and aiming an uppercut right for Beerus's chin. Just as it whizzed up at blinding speeds however, Beerus, for the first time since they'd started, actually shape-shifted himself into the same bird Poseidon had and easily swerved his now small, avian body over the blow. Then before the tanned fledgling god could fully process what he was doing, Beerus shifted again, this time into a bulky stallion himself, only colored a deep shade of purple, and in the exceedingly short period of his brother's surprise at being copied, shunted his already pulled back front legs forward. A sickening crack followed, alongside a booming shockwave as his hooves smashed directly into his little brother's chiseled face, the force slamming him hard into the ground and burying him beneath his brother's pressing horse feet, as his skull was completely crushed into paste. The ground beneath him exploding outward as perhaps the biggest crater that had been formed from a training session yet came to be, being almost 10 meters wide and nearly as deep, with Poseidon's momentarily limp body laid at its center with Beerus literally standing over him. That is how you pull off that little combo you tried on me properly, Beerus said coolly, without a lick of remorse, still in horse form, as he hopped right out of the crater, showing his brother's head reduced to a bony and brain matter mixed mush by his vicious stomp quickly mending itself back together. Next time be snappier with it and move faster while not telegraphing your moves so much. If I see you being that predictable when trying something like that on me again, I won't be so merciful next time. You're honestly lucky I wasn't cruel enough to relieve myself on top of your mushed head after that flub up. The prospect of getting you to eat shit as you healed was quite tempting. After all, it'd certainly match how much of a foul mouth you seem to have. NGHN, okay, Poseidon groaned as he felt beads of divine sweat rolling down his features once his head fully mended itself. Beings like them didn't need to relieve themselves in that way, he knew almost instinctually, however he was pretty sure they could do so if they wanted to, for whatever reason. And suffice to say, Beerus choosing to do so on top of him as a freaking horse was far from a pleasant image to be given. I get the message. Do you now? Beerus, now having shifted back to his normal form, asked pointedly as he placed his hands on his hips. His amber eyes still holding that same glare down on him from above the crater. And what would that be? That I've still got a lot to learn, and that I should watch my mouth in the future. Good. It seems that thick skull of yours is capable of learning after all. Beerus said snidely, his irritation only calming down slightly. And for the record, no. I wasn't relieving myself in the way your perverted mind was thinking of, you idiot. His eyes narrowed sharply, making Poseidon shrink in on himself. Never insinuate that crap about me again. What he'd actually done was gone through with his angered and disgusted thoughts following Hera's act, and genuinely ripped his cock and tongue off before destroying them. The pain had been fleeting, since they'd just grown back instantly. Thankfully without the taste of Hera's spit in the latter, and the former not being embarrassingly and disturbingly hard as steel. An image he'd had to bury away when just the thought of that rancid, recent memory of Hera's act caused his traitorous new member to tingle in a way it absolutely shouldn't have been doing. By his former Lord Zeno's robes, this body of his truly was strange in all the wrong ways when it came to how it was reacting to that kind of shit. If he didn't figure out why that was soon enough, he may well lose his sanity long before he dealt with that prick Kronos for good. In any case, putting your stupidity aside, Beerus continued. We can continue if you want. I think I vented enough there to get my point across. And he'd be bringing something similar towards Hera when it was her turn. Which was soon, given thanks to her, he'd had a change of heart on how the timing of these spars would go. His patience was thinner than it appeared right now, after all, so he felt like speeding this along. She'd be last, but certainly not least, after he was through with the others. And he'd be sure to run her through the ringer extra hard for doing that with him and making his confounding new body act the way it did. With Demeter, he'd been more flummoxed than anything else. Hera's felt more like a slight against him that he couldn't let go. And he wasn't about to shy away like he had last time with that blonde sister of his. Oh no, not this time. I'll go a little easier from here, if needs be. Poseidon shook his head, showing a bit of backbone that Beerus actually liked to see, as he rose to his feet. Nah. As frightening as you can be going in this hard, I think I'd feel like an absolute chump if I accepted you taking it easier on me. Well, you are a chump as of right now, but I appreciate the guts all the same. A ghost of a grin almost formed on Beerus's features as he sniped his brother down with a hint of amusement, though the annoyance was still firmly present. Come at me then, and we'll see how you do. All right then, he nodded, barely even wincing at Beerus's jab at his abilities. It was quite clear in terms of skill and technique, he was way above their mother, that much was certain. Thus, the offense wasn't that high. He then paused for a second, before gazing up at his brother with a tad bit more hopeful look. Before I do though, you in a mood to teach that pressure point thing to me now? Beerus deadpanned at him with a thoroughly unimpressed look, as if to ask without words if he was really stupid enough to have just asked him that. Then he remembered this was Poseidon he was dealing with, who clearly wasn't the brightest out there given the gall he'd had in getting him to level his fresh ire on himself when he should have been able to tell he was in a bad mood after Hera's stunt. He then shook his head as a sigh passed through his lips, deciding to throw him a bone. If you can manage to impress me with something as we spar, then I'll consider it. Now stop wasting time and come at me. The younger sibling didn't need to be told twice and did so immediately, launching right at his brother with renewed vigor. Their spar continued on after that for another half hour, which to them was basically ages passing by, with Beerus holding back but using enough power to push Poseidon to the brink and beyond multiple times over. The latter not impressing his elder with any moves he pulled in that time they fought, but sure did impress with his tenacity and ability to learn on the fly if nothing else. Both of which that easily matched Zeus's, as he soaked up every bit of advice, no matter how harshly it was delivered to him every time he got pounded and throttled all over the area for a mistake like a sponge. And by the end, he was sat on his ass taking a break after the beating, the training, that Beerus had graciously put him through. Yes, that was what he'd meant to say there. Not bad overall. The purple-haired deity shrugged, gazing down on him with aura no longer present. You were pretty decent against me, all things considered. Keep this work rate up and you should be good. Thanks, I guess, Poseidon breathed, a part of him thankful the manhandling was over, and the other for his brother's guidance, even if crudely delivered. So, did I impress enough? Beerus rolled his eyes, having seen that one coming a mile away. I'll think about it. No promises. Guess that's all I can ask for then. Poseidon sighed somewhat contentedly, much more chilled out now that they weren't fighting anymore, and for the fact that his older brother seemingly wasn't aggravated with him anymore. Or at least he hoped so anyway, as he rose up to his feet. Suppose I might as well go and join back with the others, seeing as we're done here. He then paused, the idea of asking Beerus why he reacted the way that he did to Hera's action, and he supposed Demeter's beforehand too, crossing his mind. He thought better of it though, and decided not to voice it, given his brother would likely respond poorly to it. I guess I'll see you around, brother. Before you go, Poseidon, I'll have to ask you to send Hades my way. It's his turn now. It is. Poseidon blinked in confusion, having already turned halfway away from his elder. I thought we were all going on different days though. Change of plans. Beerus simply said, knowing this would put his own true divine form training on hold for a day, but not caring in the least. I've decided I'll be taking everyone on today to see how they've progressed. Everyone other than Hera, that is. I'm saving her for tomorrow. He remarked in a way that left no room for argument. Poseidon nodded affirmatively and did as he was asked after a small moment of hesitation, holding back the urge to say something smart about him singling Hera out, as he already knew where that path led. he was gone in a flash of golden flecks not a second later. Beerus took the brief intermission to glance up a ways away from himself, approximately a dozen miles away where the trio of Hecatonchias with the Cyclopes atop their shoulders were sat in a semicircle chatting animatedly with the now equally as huge Gear in the center between them. All of them seeming to be having a great time now that they were reunited, with big smiles on their faces. Beerus didn't care much for the mushy stuff, but in a sense, he was glad that the primordial goddess was more preoccupied chatting it up with her sons right now, as given that unnerving smile she'd had after Hera's kiss, which he'd barely glanced as he made his way off from everyone, he knew damn well she'd be teasing the crap out of him right now if not for them. A part of him silently thanked the 6 former prisoners of Tartarus, as they'd basically saved him from that hell for now. Not a moment too soon, his favorite brother materialized before him through golden specks of his own. And thankfully, unlike Poseidon, Hades could actually read the room as soon as he arrived and made no mention of Hera's little get back at him, nor did he ask why Beerus had changed the initial plan. Though that likely had more to do with the fact that that decision meant he was now getting what he wanted sooner than he'd thought. Been looking forward to this, brother? The pale-skinned younger brother gave an eager grin, seeing as he was about to get his spar earlier than expected. Once again, to Beerus's relief, keeping the topic purely on fighting and not wasting time getting into a rough, but acceptable fighting stance, which he definitely preferred. It was no wonder really why he got along so well with him, given he didn't faff about and just got straight to the point. Looking forward to seeing how I do. Beerus actually managed to give his little brother a light smirk, given his likeness for him was enough to thaw through his current irritation somewhat, as he propped his hands on his hips. As am I. Now show me what you've got, Hades, and don't hold back. Oh, don't you worry, brother, Hades began, as he suddenly blitzed right into Beerus with a lunging fist coated in a dark aura that the latter narrowly dodged by leaning back. I wouldn't waste your time doing something as pointless as that. The second spar of the day commenced swiftly, with Hades launching into a flurry against his brother. Most of his punches and kicks thrown being reasonably sharp and precise, with the occasional more wild, less focused attacks sprinkled throughout. Beerus bobbed and weaved, evading all his brother's opening shots easily enough, before responding with a few blows of his own. First snapping a kick up toward Hades' jaw as he came in, which was narrowly avoided by a torque of the pale-skinned deity's body to the left, which then had to be followed up with a duck down to his knees to avoid a sudden teleport from Beerus into a mid-air sweeping kick. One that nearly decapitated him, as the elder of the two became enveloped in dark purple once more. The younger of the two then teleporting away himself to evade Beerus's following plunge down with a hard fist after twisting his body around in midair, which smashed the ground beneath into a sizable crater that joined up with the huge one he'd made stomping on Poseidon. Beerus moved without thinking as he got in a crouch, and blocked a punch aimed at the side of his face as Hades reappeared, before quickly snapping up from the ground and swinging his leg forth in a blurringly fast roundhouse kick towards the paler fledgling god's exposed neck. One that Hades shape-shifted into a snake to avoid, while coiling skillfully around the swung appendage, before lashing out seemingly to bite at Beerus's neck. An attack he paid for as instead of dodging or trying to catch him, Beerus struck out with just 2 joint fingers, landing flush on his serpentine forehead, and making him briefly go limp as he was knocked unconscious. This was followed up by him pulling his brother away from his arm and tossing him away with a throw like that of a baseball pitcher, sending him careening towards the same mountainside he'd indented Poseidon with before. Just before collision though, Hades snapped awake and teleported away just in the nick of time, reappearing behind Beerus in his normal form and striking out with a hard kick of his own for the spine. Beerus backflipped seamlessly over it when the sole of his foot was merely an inch away and threw a bicycle kick midair with enough force to crush Hades' head down into his body. Hades wisely backed away with a well-timed jump, only to be accosted by Beerus just as he touched down, when Beerus teleported before his eyes right into his guard, delivering a strong fist to the gut. One that broke ribs and knocked the wind, as well ichor-infused sputum from the pale deity's mouth. Instead of being launched away however, Hades actually surprised Beerus a small bit, by having grabbed onto his wrist the instant he'd been struck, and not letting go despite the massive amount of shooting pain in his abdomen. Holding on hard, he stopped himself from being thrown back, and despite his momentary pain, clenched a fist and managed to throw a punch right back, which skinned off of Beerus's jaw as his head barely swayed away from the blow in time. This didn't stop Hades from pressing forward though when Beerus pulled back, thrusting his leg up for a flurry of high-speed kicks toward his big brother's abdomen and chest, forcing the latter to block them all with some difficulty using his free hand, before he broke out of Hades' grip. "Hey, you're one tough bastard to try that on me, Hades, I'll give you that," Beerus remarked bemusedly as he jumped back, realizing now that Hades actually might have been able to avoid his strike, but chose to take it in order to sucker him in. Now that took some balls. "I have no idea what you mean, brother." Hades smiled almost ferally, showing his teeth tainted by ichor, as his ribs quickly mended themselves. He was already throwing himself back at Beerus before then though, punches and kicks flying from just about every direction he could send them, as he began teleporting all around Beerus in rapid succession to keep him on his toes. "Is that right?" Beerus only grinned a little wider at his brother being cheeky with that answer, as his arms and legs flew out, blocking every blow in Hades' twister of attacks with his hands, forearms and knees without losing a beat. "Well then, let's see how you handle this." Beerus suddenly speared forth in between Hades' attacks, smacking a pressure point near his shoulder, deadening the arm and making it go limp by his side just as Hades was mid-punch. Eyes widening with surprise, before he could respond, Beerus had already done the same with the other arm, making it fall down around his side like a dangling noodle, leaving him without a guard, as he shot his foot up in a sidekick that crushed his nose into his face, sending small, twin jets of gold blood rocketing out. All as he was sent rocketing back, this time followed by an explosive shockwave from the force of the kick, forcing him to flip over in midair and press his feet into the ground, digging some wide trenches as he came skidding to a stop about half a mile out from where he'd been struck. Ugh, how in the world did he do that? The dark-haired deity couldn't help but mutter, having that strange fighting technique used on him twice now, as he dropped down to a crouch. The feeling in both his arms returning soon after. "Last long enough, and I'll tell you all about it." Hades' head whipped back, as he heard Beerus's voice behind him. His dark eyes widening again as he saw Beerus little over a meter above him with his leg raised up to his shoulder for another attack. Pure instinct more than anything saved him there, as he barrel rolled out of the way right as Beerus's leg swung down like the axe of an executioner, his foot impacting against the ground and blasting a crapload of debris everywhere, as a 10-meter wide and deep crater was formed beneath him. "Hey, I plan to do more than last, brother," Hades shouted out excitedly, bounding up to his feet just outside the newly formed crater. "Better get ready, because I'm making a comeback. Don't you go getting cocky now, Hades. I've already got enough of that in my spars with Zeus." Beerus quipped jokingly, beginning to have a more fun time sparring with Hades, as he leapt out of the hole he'd made and engaged his brother. The two trading strikes in close quarters as they started battling around the area, throwing savage haymakers and brutal kicks in each other's direction. Both mirroring each other for a moment as they formed multiple smaller craters around them from the force behind their blows' shockwaves, blocking and parrying what the other dished out, something that was clearly much harder on Hades, but he never so much as grimaced. No matter how many times his divine bones rattled and shook from the strikes he stopped, he simply endured it with an expression so stony it almost made even Beerus believe he wasn't getting affected somehow by blocking his clearly more powerful blows. Of course, Hades couldn't quite keep this up and eventually disengaged by hopping back before one of his limbs snapped like a twig. He wasn't out of the woods though, as Beerus almost immediately re-engaged him in good old-fashioned hand-to-hand. Hades again kept up well enough but did let a few strikes sneak past him this time as Beerus exploited his imperfect guard, being sure to throw out the occasional bit of advice every time he punished him for a wrong move, though certainly doing so a good deal less crudely than he had with Poseidon. Mostly because the former hadn't done anything to annoy him. The spar would go on for about the same amount of time that his previous one had, and in that time, unlike Poseidon, Hades actually did manage to land two incredibly well-timed blows on him as he soaked up everything he told him about his weak points. One being a nice kick to the body that knocked some wind out of him, and the other being a sharp elbow to the chin that seemed to be just as surprising to Hades as it was to him with how it came out of nowhere as he was being pushed back. In the end though, Hades was still outclassed and was on the back foot for pretty much the majority of the spar. Regardless, Beerus was rather satisfied with what he saw from Hades as they finished up. He dare say even a little proud of how his favorite brother was coming along in his training, as he thanked him for the spar and dematerialized with a content, pleased expression. Promising to fetch him the next of their siblings to test themselves against him. That turned out to be Demeter. Unlike Hades, she actually did ask him why the sudden change from what he originally said, all whilst having this baffling look to her as she eyed him. One that actually looked envious for some silly reason, as he heard her mutter under her breath about Hera going further than she did. He probably couldn't have tuned that gag-worthy drivel out faster before he had an aneurysm over where that conversation would probably lead, and got her to focus more on sparring, and less on talking about something he'd rather not discuss. After all, he'd probably get a full dose of this cringy shit he'd unfortunately got roped into when he finally had Hera herself in front of him with how smug she probably was right now. As for the spar itself, when Demeter finally put her thoughts on other subjects, Beerus wanted no part of mentally to the side and actually engaged him. Two things became apparent. The first was that she was craftier than he'd given her credit for, as she used shapeshifting for her attacks and combos more than either of his brothers did combined and came dangerously close to getting him plenty of times given how much he was holding back. The best example being when she dodged away from one of his kicks and transformed into an eagle to fly close and claw off his face, then changing into a snake to slither around the arm he brought up to swat her away, before changing into a fly to avoid his grabbing hand. All of which got her right in his grill as she transformed back to normal in mid-swing of a beautifully executed, mid-air dropkick that Beerus was genuinely forced to use teleportation to escape from. Quite the feat considering he preferred using his own natural reflexes over teleportation, so getting him to use that in defense rather than offense was worthy of a small bit of praise. The second thing that became apparent was that while she was much better focused when actually in combat, Beerus could still spot moments in their spar where Demeter became victim to that absent-mindedness that still seemed to plague her. Even if it was nowhere near as bad as it had been earlier on, it was clearly still there when her mind seemed to wander off for the briefest of instants in combat whenever she couldn't seem to break through his defense. Something he made her pay for each time with either a stunning or clobbering blow to either her torso or legs, and on the most egregious of these occasions, he'd strike a pressure point on her forehead to knock her out for her carelessness. Something he'd only gotten to do twice, though he'd prefer it if he didn't get the chance to do that at all, as he made sure to accost her for those errors and explain how she could improve further from what she was doing. By the end of the third spar, which was also as long as the last two, he gave her a small compliment for her efforts, since she'd overall done fine against him outside of that character flaw she still had that was somewhat of a detriment to her. She gave him a quick hug of gratitude in return following it, which almost turned comical when she tried to sneak in another kiss somewhere on his face, he didn't care where, and he'd caught her shoulders and spun her around before she could this time. It's probably best if you go fetch Hestia for me, now. We wouldn't want to keep our dear sister waiting now, would we? Beerus told her fast, not about to deal with any more kissy face crap if he could. Fine, he caught the disappointed pout she'd given at not getting to kiss him again, and quite frankly, he didn't want to know how far she'd go with it if she did, as just the thought alone made him mentally cringe. Doubly so when his bastard crotch tingled again from it like some damn teenage mortal brats that had his blasted hormones all over the place. I'll see you later then, Beerus, she said, seeming to reinvigorate herself with some form of determination, and he dare not want to know for what it was for concerning him, as she blew him a kiss with her hand before leaving. Good grief, as she disappeared, he was starting to think self-castration might end up the norm for him if his body kept being stupid like this without any real reason behind it that he was aware of. Any such thoughts of that he put on the back burner though when his twin sister, and frankly his favorite sibling Hestia, appeared before him a moment later. Her smile just as kind and pleasant to see as it always was, though it was tinted with concern for him. Are you doing all right, Beerus? She asked with her hands clasped in front and below her waist, not letting the smile slip, but her worry was clear in her voice, just as it was in her glowing eyes. You seemed rather off-put after Hera's get back, as she called it. The eldest of the seven spawn of the Titan King and Queen blushed a little, as she coughed into her hand. I'm fine, Hestia. It's nothing for you to worry about, Beerus assured her, and technically he wasn't lying. Mentally he was scarred, but physically he was completely fine. His asshole of a sexual organ notwithstanding. The former god of Universe 7 unable to get irritable with her despite her bringing Hera's payback up even if he tried. He just didn't have it in him to do that to her, which was funny if one looked back at his past and saw all the planets he'd blown up without a care for the people that perished. Yet just the thought of snapping at her and potentially upsetting her had him feeling like his stomach might twist into a knot. Like somehow that alone felt more egregious to him than any of the screw-ups he'd made in his past life. Are you sure? Yes, I am. After all, she was simply rewarding me for my efforts, as she said. And I'll be sure to return the favor tomorrow when it's her turn to spar with me. Well, if you say so, Hestia replied, not sounding wholly convinced, but choosing to drop it regardless, as it was clear that her dear brother wanted to leave it at that, and she was nothing if not respectful of his wishes. Be sure to let me know if you ever are feeling off-put though, alright? I'd be more than happy to lend whatever help I could to cheer you up if you needed it. He. You're too kind, Hestia. Beerus actually chuckled slightly in earnest. And he meant that, truly. At this point, he was honestly beginning to wonder if Hestia even had a single selfish bone in her body. Seriously, he'd never met anyone who came across this pure. She wasn't even using that aura of hers, and she was already making him feel more at ease. It wouldn't last once he got to his final sparring partner out of the pack, but he was inwardly grateful for it, nonetheless. I'll be sure to keep that in mind. Now then, how about we get down to business? Right. She nodded, maintaining her beatific smile as they changed subject, and she got into a bit of a defensive stance. I'm ready when you are, dear brother. Out of the 4 spars he went through, this one had to be the most unique in his mind. Leaving aside that even he had to force himself to go and strike at her, since like Rhea, or everyone for that matter, the idea of hurting her sickened him, she proved to be a fairly adept fighter. One that was made dangerous in her own peculiar way, as he found out, when she actually started using her normally tranquil and homely aura against him in a more aggressive manner. Something that had led to her getting the upper hand on him multiple times throughout the spar, surprisingly enough, as she sapped his will to attack in an instant with her soothing aura, before whacking him in the face with a palm strike or hitting him with a practiced combination of palm thrusts and the occasional kick. In essence, before he figured out how to counter what she was doing, she managed to land more blows on him than anyone so far by a mile. Heck, she'd probably landed even more than Zeus had in their first spar with one another. That had changed quick when he'd finally managed to push through that unique ability of hers. After getting tripped up by her impressive power a good few times, he'd figured out its weakness. If one's willpower was strong enough in the face of it, as in, stronger than hers, then it could be outright resisted if one so chose to. Normally, under any other circumstance, he wouldn't have, as he loved that calming, warm sensation it brought over him. However, the purpose of these spars was to check how good all his siblings had gotten, test them, and then give them his best advice for improvement when he found their flaws, so he railed against her aura on this occasion. Pushing past it with some difficulty, as he pressed forward and started pressuring his favorite sibling. The rest of the spar from there was just standard fare once he'd broken through her ability. She was about the same level as Hades was, if not a little above, without that power of hers from what he could surmise, which was quite impressive in his mind. Of course, he had to hold back an intense cringe every time one of his attacks landed home on her after that point, and he heard her bones crack or break from the force he put into them, as he had said he wouldn't go easy on her. To Hestia's credit though, she never screamed in pain and simply took it all on the chin, recovering when she could and going right back into the scrap with him, taking in all the feedback he offered along the way. Something that earned her even more respect from him than she'd already had. When the spar eventually came to an end, Beerus allowed Hestia to give him a hug too, only this time he didn't have to worry about a non-familial snog coming his way, as his twin kept it to a simple, but relaxing embrace. She left not longer after, waving him goodbye with that sunny smile of hers as she then dematerialized back to their mother and the others, sans Zeus probably. It was cutting into evening time now and wouldn't be long before the night draped over the sky. Beerus was about to start pondering if he should just call it an early day today and catch a nap before he took on Hera tomorrow, or if he should try and get a bit of true divine form training in before night fell, when he was met with a loud thud behind him. One that had him turning around and meeting gazes with one of the Cyclopes that he'd saved earlier, who was grinning at him in a friendly manner, as he rose to his full height at over 25 feet tall. Hey, you're a pretty good teacher, Beerus. Got a lot of fancy moves to ya too from what I saw, and this big old eye of mine has seen quite a bit before I got thrown down into Tartarus, let me tell ya. The Cyclops, who if Beerus recalled right was called Arges, complimented genuinely, looking more than a little impressed with his moves, apparently. HMPH. Thanks for the praise, I suppose. Beerus shrugged, not all that surprised that one of Gear's freed sons might have actually started watching him at some point after he'd glanced in their direction earlier. What brings you to me though? With how animated you all were before, I'd have thought you and your mother would be talking each other's heads off until dawn. Hey, funny ya mention that actually. While you were having your spars, Ma filled us all in on the details of what's going on. Every last one of them. Arges nodded with an astute look as he crossed his arms over his broad, sturdy chest while gazing down at his and his fellow brethren's savior. And I gotta tell ya, me and my two brothers, Brontes and Steropes, we got the perfect way for us to pay you back in no time. Is that right? Beerus rose a brow, intrigued by the Cyclops. Yeah. Ya see, me and my one-eyed brothers aren't really fighters per se. Don't get me wrong, we can fight, it's just not the thing we gravitate towards, unlike our big boy brothers Briareus, Cottus and Gidges. Those guys will be a huge boon in open combat, but as for me and my fellow one-eyed siblings, we like to think of ourselves as craftsmen. Don't matter what you want built, we can make it. Arges explained dutifully with confidence. His tone alone making it clear he believed every word, and that it wasn't just a mere boast. I see. Mind telling me how that could be useful? Beerus asked inquisitively, as he propped his hands on his hips yet again. Gladly. Arges' teeth shined as he gave a toothy smile. I assume you know about your prick of a dad's weapon of choice. Beerus nodded at this. While he hadn't personally seen the scythe for himself, Gia had mentioned it in passing, and what it was capable of. Well, it just so happens we know the kind of material used to make it, and the magic that goes into forging an item like that. What would you say if I told you me and brothers could forge you and a couple others some similar items with their own unique powers to level the playing field? Well, I'd say you have my attention, at least. Beerus replied with a smirk, one that Arges easily mirrored. Hey, well how's this for an attention grabber then? We can also build you a proper base of operations in a more secure location. One that neither has to worry about Kronos's all-seeing gaze, and with our help, is less likely than this place to get found out by that punk Hyperion if he manages to find his way back here. Okay, now the former destroyer of the seventh universe was quite interested indeed. Go on. I'm listening. It's a massive mountain several hundred miles away from here. It's the only mountain I'm aware of in the whole universe that's bigger than O3's, in fact. He went on. Its peak pierces far into the heavens. So much so, that it's entirely out of Kronos range using our bastard father's throne. That thing only allows him to look down upon the infinite expanse of the earth and the boundless sea, due to him not being able to use its full potential. No one other than our father, or someone bonded to the domain of the sky can have absolute vision everywhere with it. Something he just doesn't have, even now, according to Ma. Well, that answered his question as to how Arges knew this, anyhow. Beerus held his tongue from there and allowed the Cyclops to continue, which he happily did. As for Hyperion, well, just give me and my brothers a few days over at the mountain in question and we can construct something that should keep him at bay, even if it can't stop him from finding you lot eventually. The creature's single eye then seemed to twinkle. Oh, and don't worry about the new venue not being as durable for any training you want to do. Even without Mars' assistance on it, from what I remember, this mountain was tough enough on its own to tank a hard punch from Kotis and not break from the impact. Add a bit of help from Mar on top of that, and this thing will be essentially unbreakable from top to bottom. Heck, I doubt it'll even start shaking slightly until you get close to busting out a true divine form for yourself. Once again, Beerus heard nothing but absolute confidence from Arj's tone when speaking. Not a single waver to indicate he might be lying or not know what he was talking about. He was being truthful. And although a small part of him wondered why Kotis had punched this mountain in the first place back in the day, he honestly didn't care enough to ask about it. All he needed to know was that apparently it could withstand a blow from one of the Hecatonchires without added protection from gear, which, considering the immense power that he sensed within each that dwarfed his own currently, that was quite the feat. So, what do ya say, Beerus? You willing to swap out the scenery for what I just told you about, or would you prefer to just hunker down here instead and continue as is? It's up to you. Either way, we'll still be forging those tools for ya when we can, so you don't have to be concerned about that if you refuse. The purple-haired god pondered over this briefly, before shrugging once again as he came to a decision. One that, if given all he'd just been told was accurate, made this choice obvious to him. I'd say I'm game, so long as this place is as you describe. Trust me, it is. You won't regret relocating there. Just give me and my brothers a couple days to set things up for ya, and you should be good to go. I assume you have a way to get over there and back without getting caught. Yeah. Just dematerialize up to the mountain's peak, go about our business, and then materialize back down here. Easy as can be, Kronos won't see a thing. Ah. Fair enough then. He should have guessed that. Whether it was someone else doing it for them or them doing it themselves, teleporting back and forth was the most logical course of action there. Alright, guess that's that sorted then. So, what's the name of this massive mountain, assuming it has one anyway? Arjais merely uttered 2 words in response, which to Beerus's ears seemed to carry a hefty amount of weight behind him as he spoke the name of their soon-to-be new home. One that, though he didn't know it yet, would go on to become his family's one true residence for an eternity to come. Mount Olympus.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like this video if you want some more what if video. Comment 3 hearts for more what if.